the point of departure is that Rabbi Kushner, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
The point of departure is that Rabbi Kushner passed away. And I was at his funeral last week, May 1st. And, I've read his books, and I have even read his books of sermons that he's published. He's published 2 different books of sermons. But the eulogy that Rabbi Richmond delivered included an excerpt from a sermon that was never published before. It's not in the other books. And it was, in fact, the first sermon that he gave to Temple Israel in Natick for the first Rosh Hashanah that he was there, September the 15th, 1966. It's his first high holiday sermon. And I found it, when I heard it, Rabbi Richmond just offered these words. When I heard it, it really made me think a lot. And it's about immortality. And I know that I sent it to you in the teaser yesterday. But what I wanted to do today is the following. I want to first just read out loud these words from Rabbi Kushner in his first high holiday sermon, 1966, about immortality. And first, I want to ask you, what comes up for you when you hear it? Do you think about immortality? Is immortality an issue? However you would define it, he defines it however you might define it. Then the second thing I want to ask about is, do we think it's actually real? Like, is there such a thing as immortality? I mean, if you're Maimonides and you wrote the Mishnah Torah, there's immortality. And if you're Shakespeare and you wrote his opus, there's immortality. But for people who are not, if you're Mozart, there's immortality. But if you're not Mozart or Maimonides or Shakespeare, is there immortality for us ordinary people? What does that mean if we take that concept seriously? Then a third question I want to ask you is how God fits into this. And then at the very end, I'll share with you my own thinking about it and how it connects directly to the holiday of Shavuot, which is coming up shortly. There's a verse in the story of the giving of the Torah at Sinai that I feel connects directly to this question of our own personal immortality and whether it's attainable, and if so, what that would even mean. So that's our agenda. So Rhiannon, thank you so much. Our faithful host, Rhiannon, is hosting. And Rhiannon, could you go to the bottom of page 3 of the handout? I just want to read these words that Rabbi Kushner delivered and that Rabbi Richmond delivered in Rabbi Kushner's name. And I want to ask you guys to respond emotionally or spiritually or intellectually, however, whatever response comes out from you, I would love to hear it, okay? These are, this is from the bottom of page 3, okay? There is a dream each of us has secretly in his heart. By the way, just one note about it. He delivers this in 1966. So the use of pronouns in 1966 is not the way that we use pronouns today. There's a lot of he and him. You remember that Abraham Joshua Heschel's book, written about this time, was called God in Search of Man. Today, we wouldn't use those kinds of pronouns. We wouldn't write that way. But so just, I'm going to read what he wrote, just factor in it was a different time. There is a dream each of us has secretly in his heart, unless some of us have already given it up as unattainable. The ambition to be somebody significant, to matter, to make a difference to the world. None of us wants to feel that at the end of his days, he will have passed through the world and left no trace behind, that he's had no real impact on the world. We would like to justify our existence, to stake our claim to some sort of immortality, on some remarkable achievement that will leave the world different for our having been part of it. And yet, what can we do? Very few, if any of us, will write a book that will be read 20 years from now. It's not likely that any of us in this room today will come up with a medical discovery that will save lives or an invention that will enrich lives. Who of us will have a bridge, a street, a building named after him? But Judaism speaks to this secret yearning of ours and says that it's possible. It's within the power of every one of us to be a memorable person, to live a significant and impressive life. Judaism offers us not only the secret of life, but the secret of immortality, of living beyond our appointed years. How to be the kind of parent who will be remembered with words of blessing. How to be a friend who won't easily be forgotten. How to be the kind of neighbor whose impact on a community will remain even after he's gone from the scene. Anyone's life can be fashioned into a spiritual masterpiece. The Jewish equivalent of sainthood is not reserved for a small group of unusual souls who are separated from the rest of society. Sainthood, that is, a life of spiritual excellence, is the prerogative of anyone who takes life seriously. You don't have to be a particular talent for religion to be a spiritually remarkable person. Thank you, Rhiannon. So, what is he saying, and how does that land for you? Love any voices on this call. Linda and then Maddie. Thank you. Linda. And if you can unmute, thank you.
Am I muted?
No, you're perfect now.
I think that's, I have to say, and I'm not a big scholar of Jewish history, but it never frankly occurred to me that you define immortality in some way by the personal relationships that you've left behind. And I think that's very, very telling. I know for myself personally, I certainly won't be known for any of those other things, but I'm fortunate to have not a relatively small, but very close family, and a really special relationship with my two grandchildren. So be able to think that having them brought up with a lot of love and having the kind of family we've had, hoping that'll happen more in the future is great, but I don't think I would have thought to put the word immortality to it.
Yeah, Linda, thank you for that. That's very candid and bracing. Here's what I hear you saying. Tell me if this is what you're saying. This is right, which is, when you think about immortality, you didn't think to put the word immortality to it. You think of immortality as something like forever, or like a long time, many, many generations. We're still thinking about Maimonides. He lived from 1135 to 1204. We're still thinking about Shakespeare. He lived in the 16th century. We're still playing Mozart's music. He lived hundreds of years ago. And when you think of immortality, you think that that is what the word is about, is an impact that is beyond our lifetime and the lifetime of our children and grandchildren. It's hundreds of years. And what Rabbi Kushner seems to be talking about is, if you're a really special parent and grandparent, you live on through the deeds and the stories and the values that you give to your children and grandchildren. And what I hear you saying is that's great. You have two grandkids that you have a very special relationship with, but that's not Mozart. That's not Maimonides. That's not Shakespeare. That's not immortality. Is that right? So that is that what you're saying? It's like you get immortality for a couple of generations if you're lucky, but that's not immortality. Is that what you're saying?
I'm not saying it is or it isn't. What I'm saying is that I find it really interesting. I would think most people wouldn't have thought of that as immortality, as part of the definition of immortality. So that's a new thought for me.
Right.
It's not that I never thought it was important or special, but I just would not have thought it one of the things that was appropriate for that label.
Yeah. So, Linda, thank you. I mean, I will say that I think if you define immortality as Maimonides immortality, Shakespeare immortality, Isaac Newton immortality, then I don't think that actually what Rabbi Kushner says is accurate. Because I think we live on in the words and memories and stories and deeds and values of our children and grandchildren, maybe for 2 generations if we're lucky, Probably not 3, and certainly not 4. I mean, if you think about it, most of us on this call can remember our parents. And you know, if you had a loving relationship with your parents, you can talk about your parents and you remember your parents' your side. And if you're lucky, you can remember your grandparents and they live on. How many of us actually can really remember, know a lot about our great grandparents? I'll put it this way. Every night I'm at the Gant Chapel for the evening minyan, and every night we mark yortzites. And you know, and people often remember their parents. And people sometimes remember, rarely, not doesn't happen very often, but it does happen occasionally, their grandparents. I don't think I've ever been to an evening minyan, and we do this literally 7 nights a week, where somebody says, I want to remember my great grandparent. It just doesn't happen. So I think that one of the tensions in this piece is immortality is at most a 2-generation deal. And then after that, not so much. So I wanna put that out there as an orienting question. Like if we're lucky, we'd live on in our kids and grandkids, if we're lucky. Beyond that, not so much, unless, you know, you wrote, you know, your version of Beethoven or Mozart or Kant, and most of us have not. But we'll get back to that, what you do with that. Maddie Donoff, your hand was up.
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. I want to take a little different tack to this. I found this extremely humble, but I had to remind myself that he wrote this in 1966 when he was just starting in his new pulpit, and that he is really describing himself. He's describing himself 60 years later. And when he talks about his book, he talks about, and yet what can we do? Very few, if any of us, will write a book that will be read 20 years from now. He hadn't written that book yet.
Right.
And it's almost like he was sort of seeing into a crystal ball for the future, because in many ways, he is going to live on and be immortal, not only from his writings, but from his teachings. And I don't know whether he had any sense that that was going to happen.
Yeah, Maddie, I mean, that right. So it's true. I think Harold Kushner will be immortal in the sense that, you know, Maimonides and Shakespeare are immortal. I mean, he's the very, very, very rare person whose words and thoughts and ideas will travel throughout time, and he'll be remembered as the author of them. You know, I think hundreds of years from now, people will still be reading about it, because I think he had new things to say about God, or new things to say about God that even if they weren't completely original, I mean, Mordecai Kaplan said them as well, he brought it to a broader audience. Mordecai Kaplan talked to rabbis and rabbinical students. Harold Kushner, using Mordecai Kaplan's ideas, talked to humanity. So I think he will be remembered, but, and so it's kind of ironic, actually, and when Rabbi Richmond read those words at Harold Kushner's funeral, that few of us will be, you know, few if any of us will write a book that will be read 20 years from now. There was kind of a knowing chuckle in the crowd at his funeral, because of course, Rabbi Kushner's life himself, he wrote that book, or book, plural. But for most of us, not. So I guess my question to you, so yes, Maddie, he disproves what he writes. But what, for those of us who didn't write When Bad Things Happen to Good People, how did this land for you? And what did it make you think about your own immortality, or that whole category might apply to you?
Well, I have to say I wasn't thinking very much about my immortality. I just hope that at least the current generation, and maybe one to the future, will remember good things about me. But I think it's the idea that you'd be remembered for generations to come never even occurred to me.
Right.
I think it's rather arrogant, frankly, to think this way.
Yeah. So I want to, great, thank you. So I want to, any other comments first, just on the reaction to these paragraphs that he wrote, that Rabbi Richmond read at his eulogy. Any other reactions? And then I'm going to double click on a word. Okay, so I want to take a look. I'll just read it to you. So I think immortality, as in people will remember us, you know, many, many years from now, generations from now. I think is chimerical. It's an illusion. It doesn't happen. It's not real, except for the very few people who write something at a Shakespearean level. For the rest of us, we don't get immortality. And I think it's really good to just own that and acknowledge that. I think for the rest of us, when we live and our years are up, you know, hopefully our kids, if we're blessed to have grandkids or great grandkids, maybe, you know, the grandkids will remember us. But beyond that, not. So then the question is, how do we therefore think about our life, and what, if that kind of immortality is not on the table, what is? So he writes about to live a significant life, right? It's within the power of every one of us to be a memorable person, to live a significant and impressive life. I want to talk about significance. So first of all, I think there is a quest that is broadly shared, more than from the Maimonides and Shakespeare's of the world, to somehow have that immortality. And by the way, you all know that because the Jewish world knows this. And not only the Jewish world, the general world knows this. That's where plaques come in for fundraising. That's how synagogues and the Jewish communal institutions and universities, I mean, whenever I get an announcement from Harvard nowadays, they've named a new position. The dean is named for somebody who gave them money. The faculty of arts and science is named for somebody who gave them money, right? And I think that just like, you know, any synagogue and any federation and any day school and any Jewish institution has the Cohn room, the Goldstein room, the Smith room, this room and that room. I think that is about the human aspiration to want to live on. If I can't write Macbeth, I'll give a major gift, and there will be, you know, the Gardenswartz foyer, the Gardenswartz vestry, and that way my name will live on. I think that idea is in there, but I guess my question to you is, how do you think that works? In other words, when you all have been in the synagogue, you've walked down the hallways. Do you think plaques work? What is the efficacy of plaques? Alan, I see you saying something. So if you could speak, I'd love to hear it. What is the efficacy of plaques?
It's still, how should I say, short-lived. Buildings don't live forever. Buildings come down, plaques disappear. It's still a false sense of immortality. It just serves one's ego to see their name in there. That's what it is, as far as I'm concerned.
That's right. Yeah. Let me give you a challenge, guys. Okay, here's a challenge. I mean, I think so. When the name goes on the plaque, and I think the plaque is about the aspiration for immortality. At the moment, it feels good in the moment, but if you think about, does it actually work? What's the afterglow? What's the after impact? Are people still thinking about the names that are on the plaque? I think pretty clearly the answer to that is no, a resonant no. If you walk around, let's say you're in the Gantt, you leave the Gantt Chapel, not through the side that leads to the office suite, but the side that leads to the classrooms, like room 24, 25. There are all these plaques that are up of the people who founded Temple Emmanuel from 1934. The people who are on the building committee in the 30s, and the people who were the first board of directors. Whoever looks at that stuff? Nobody ever looks at that stuff. So I think it's worth noting, I mean, this reflection on immortality, you can't get there through plaques. You can get in the moment ego satisfaction, but you can't actually get there through plaques, okay? So if you can't get there through plaques, then the question is, let's reframe what our goal is. And he talks about significance, to live a life that is significant and impressive. And he talks about that the Jewish equivalent of sainthood is not reserved for a small group of unusual souls. Sainthood, that is a life of spiritual excellence, is the prerogative of anyone who takes life seriously. So I wanted to give you a reinterpretation of this idea of immortality into significance. And I wanted to give you another idea of Rabbi Kushner's for you to think about as we head into Shavuot and as we think about building a life of significance, okay? This is from his book, Who Needs God? And my colleagues and I talked about it on Shabbat in our Talmud class. But here, if you haven't read the book or didn't watch the class, let me give you the core point, okay? You've all read Psalms, including Psalm 146, that will say, God feeds the hungry, or God takes care of widows and orphans, or God frees the oppressed. And what Rabbi Kushner says in the book, Who Needs God? Is that those are not activities that God actually does. God does not actually feed the hungry. There are plenty of hungry people who go to bed hungry at night, and God does not feed them. Rather, Rabbi Kushner says that feeding the hungry is something we do, and when we do it, we feel the presence of God. So God feeds the hungry really means that we feed the hungry, and when we do it, we feel the presence of God. And the same thing is for all those activities that are mentioned in the Psalms. God frees the oppressed. When we do work to help the oppressed, that is something we do and we feel the presence of God. God takes care of the widow and the orphan. That is something that we do. When we do it, we feel the presence of God. And then Rabbi Kushner says that the question is not where is God, but when is God? And that the whole idea of religion should be thought about as activities that when we do those activities, we feel the presence of God and we invest our life with significance. That's Judaism. It's when is God, that when we do it, then we feel the presence of God, we invest our lives with significance. How does that concept land for you? And is it helpful? Does that make the idea of God and, a spiritual masterpiece that he writes about, does that make it more accessible? Anybody? Annette. Oh, you just muted yourself, Annette.
Sorry, I undid it and did it.
Yes.
I'm not thinking about, does that make God more acceptable?
Accessible.
Accessible.
Yes.
Oh, you said accessible.
Accessible. Does that make God more, can you access God more easily by thinking about, the when instead of the where question? When is God instead of where is God? Does it make it more accessible? Can we access God?
I think that then I have a different response. I think I have to think about that because I'm not thinking about accessing God. The question is, what do I feel? And how can I translate that feeling at that time that I'm doing something that is significant? Or I'm thinking about choices and will one be more significant than another? So you're making me try to jump to a place that I'm not feeling right now. So it doesn't feel right, but it's something to think about.
Annette, thank you for that. Can I just name an interesting disconnect, which is that in the sources of our faith, God plays a very big role. But in the actual lives we live, God, for the most part, is not a big factor. And so Rabbi Kushner writes a lot about God and how to make God real. And yet, for example, I was teaching Michelle and Elias and I were teaching a group of 6th grade parents and their kids who were talking, and the whole subject was mitzvah projects, different mitzvah projects they're doing around town for their bar and bat mitzvah year. And I taught this, since it was about mitzvah, and since it was the week Rabbi Kushner died, I taught this one page, simple and clear, from Who Needs God, that when you say God feeds the hungry, it's not God who feeds the hungry, it's we feed the hungry. And when you do, you feel the presence of God. And I taught that page from Rabbi Kushner's book, and I asked people how it made them feel, what it made them think. And there was utter silence, like total silence, total absence of any reaction at all. So much so that I said, can I just name this confusion? It feels like this is a very underachieving topic, underachieving issue, that nobody has thoughts or feelings, at least that they're willing to share about this subject. Could you just help me understand the disconnect? And basically, what the parents said was, God is not a helpful category to us. And so language about God and pages about God and books about God just don't connect with us. And these are from bar mitzvah families whose kids are doing bar mitzvah projects. So I guess I just wanted to ask this question. I mean, so Annette, that your comment made me think about the feedback I had just gotten. And I'm wondering what, if anybody wants to share whether God is an important idea for you to wrestle with, or God is an important category for you to think about as you think about investing your life with significance. Any thoughts? Paul Kalis, thank you.
I'd like to reduce the use of the word God and substitute for it, do the right thing. And doing the right thing is people inherently feel after they've done it. Now, most people will not ascribe that as being a relationship to God. They will just say, I was brought up to do the right thing. My view is that doing the right thing is of singular importance. Admiral McRaven, who was the head of the Navy Special Forces, just came out with a book called Wisdom of the Bullfrog. And he talks about doing the right thing. And people know when they're doing the right thing. And that might be as close to God as you can get for many people.
And Paul, just to understand your point, can you share your thinking about why you prefer the language and the category of doing the right thing to the category of God or God language?
Because so many things don't work out. When things work out, people say, thank God. When things don't work out, they say, where is God? And God doesn't seem to be the answer for many people when things run awry. And in that sense, God is a failure. So if God is a failure, why should you spend a lot of your effort trying to accept the thing called God?
So Paul, I totally hear you and get you. I have one question for you, my dear friend.
Sure.
What do you do with prayer services, where there's a lot of God language? I mean, God is in the Siddur on every page. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Baruch atah Adonai. There's a lot of Baruch atah Adonai. And then what do you do with the Torah reading, where there's a lot of Adonai? And what do you do with the Haftarah? There's a lot of Adonai. So I just want to name this disconnect. I hear what you're saying 100%.
Yeah.
How do you connect that with the reality that in our texts, God is on every page?
Well, when I go to services, and I come across a lot of God says, I start reading the English. I mean, I'm looking at the Hebrew, but then I'm going over to the English. When I read the English, I am fulfilled because the morality in much of the English is just excellent. When it's said in Hebrew, it has no meaning to me.
Hmm.
But I don't know how you substitute the word God with something else.
Let me ask you this question, Paul. One last question, and then I'll let you off the hot seat.
It's okay.
You think that it's the job of a synagogue, like your synagogue, like Temple Emmanuel, to keep using God language and talking about God and teaching God because it's in the prayer book and in the Torah? Or do you think it's the job of a synagogue like yours, Temple Emmanuel, to listen to people's reluctance and stop talking about God?
Well, it's a little bit of both. But if you concentrate on the concept of God, and God is not successful, then you lose contact with the congregation.
Mm.
And from what I see, it's the same people who come to synagogue most of the time, except for bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs.
Right. Paul, can I ask you one last question? I promised you to get off the hot seat. I have one last
Okay.
question for you. I'm having Christian envy right now because whenever I listen to Christian worship services, they just seem to have a much easier time talking about their Lord and Savior Jesus, and they seem to be all about God and Jesus and Savior and holiness and all this stuff. Why are we blocked and so many of our Christian friends and neighbors are not blocked?
Well, that is not a small-time question. Part of it is the propaganda around the crucifixion.
Mm.
And in many of the Christian religions, not all of them, they are taught that Jesus is the Son of God, and they believe it. The ones who go, and of course, there numbers of people are going down.
Yeah.
But an example of that was the coronation of King Charles. And I said to my wife, my goodness, it's in a church, so I expect a church service, but I didn't expect such a blatant church service.
All right.
So-
Well, thank you for these very evocative comments. Other folks, I would love your thoughts about, does God have a role to play that's helpful to you as you think about investing your days and years with maximal meaning? Anyone else want to share any other thoughts on this question? Let me just get any other voices. I want to make sure anybody else, if anybody else has a thought, feel free to put it in the chat as well. So yeah, so I think that is this conversation is actually, what's interesting is there's not a generational difference. Very often, like if we're talking about Israel, there's a generational difference between the people who are on this screen and the people who go to a bar mitzvah seminar because their 12-year-old is having their bar mitzvah next year. There's a generational difference on Israel. But it feels like there's not really a generational difference on God, in that the people who are on this screen and the people who are in my 6th grade class, parents and children, alike are left cold by God language. It's so interesting because, Harold Kushner's whole life is about God language and how to understand that. So I wanted to just give you one last idea for how to think about significance and immortality. And it connects with Shavuot. And I hope this is more amenable to your thinking than God language, which is this. When the Torah is given at Sinai, there is this verse, it's in Exodus 19:19. Vayehi kol hashofar halech v'chazek ma'od. That when the Torah was being given, there was a sound of the shofar and it kept getting louder and louder and louder. And Rashi points out that the miracle is usually when somebody blows a shofar, the sound gets quieter because people run out of breath. But that the shofar at Sinai kept getting louder and louder and louder. And it speaks to what are things that get louder and louder and louder with time. Now, seems to me that the kind of immortality that we can't get unless you're Shakespeare, you can get in the following way, that you attach your life to a larger story. You attach your life to the Jewish story. You attach your life to Jewish history and Jewish destiny. And in that way, you have invested your life with something that outlives it. It preceded it, it outlives it. And it feels to me like that is a kind of immortality, making ourselves part of the Jewish story and making the Jewish story part of our lives, that all of us can do. And in that way, it connects both with Shavuot, it connects with Israel that we've been studying this entire year. And I wanted to just offer that and get your thoughts about that as well. Is there a way in which your identification with the Jewish story, Jewish history, the pathos of the Jewish story can invest you with something that preceded you and will continue long after our time is up? Any thoughts?
Wes, would you repeat that?
Yeah, I was just saying, I'm still, I was perhaps uniquely on the screen, very much taken with Rabbi Kushner's challenge about immortality. And a little bit like Linda Leffert, I love the question that he poses, but his answer that, you could have an influence on your kids and friends, that didn't feel like immortality. It felt like something that could live on for a few generations at the most. And so I was trying to figure out, how do we take this quest for immortality seriously? We talked about reinterpreting it as significance, like in the moment that your years, your however many years God gives us are significant. We talked a little bit about God's role, which, is complicated. And then this last point was, does our lifespan achieve greater heft when we identify ourselves with Jewish history and the Jewish story, that we connect ourselves to a longer story, to a larger story? And that was my question.
Maybe 1 or 2 generations is enough.
Maybe 1 or 2 generations enough. Yeah, I mean, that's all anybody gets is 1 or 2 generations. Yeah.
Do the best you can to leave a good mark for people to remember you over those 1 or 2 generations. And in our world now of technology, maybe people will have an opportunity to remember some of us longer because of the way our lives are documented.
Yeah.
I mean, we barely have any pictures or information about our great-grandparents, but hopefully 2 or 3 generations from now, they'll have more information about us. But I think to aspire to anything more than leaving your mark for the next generation or 2 is, to me, that's pretty spectacular.
Yeah, right. And you didn't say it's hubris, but I heard that. In other words, to aspire to leave your mark on a generation or 2 feels reasonable and modest and doable. Beyond that feels hubris. I wanted to just also name attention about, leaving a mark now and et cetera, which is, we're living in a country in a time where mass shootings are almost daily. The last mass shooting was the 199th mass shooting since January 1. It's now no longer noteworthy when there's a mass shooting. It's now, routine. It's like a fender bender when somebody goes off and filled with hatred for whatever group that they feel with hatred, and they have an AR-15 and they kill 7 people. That happens. That kind of event has happened 199 times. So I want to talk about the difference between where our country is and where this aspiration for a significant and beautiful life is. And how do you understand what is going on in our country at this time? Linda.
I don't think there's an easy answer, obviously. But I think that it's important not to give up trying to figure out a way. It's just that there are so many polarizing issues. We could probably mention, anyone could mention more that are polarizing than people can all agree to. And I think until that happens, doing your own level best and trying to get people you have some influence over to do the same is, and hoping that eventually you can get more people to really care. I don't think there's any one single magic bullet.
Do you feel that this problem, as you live your life and experience your country, do you feel that it's gotten worse during the course of your lifetime?
Absolutely.
Right. So I think statistically it clearly has. And I guess my question for us, as we're thinking about our life and our impact and doing right, is we're living in a time when there is a deep unwellness in the American soul. The fact that there have been 199 mass shootings and that we can't even talk about it, let alone legislate anything about it. And that no matter how many school shootings happen, there's never legislation that actually solves the problem, and it continues and it continues, it continues, and it's getting worse. And it's daily, virtually. I guess the question that I'm thinking about is, what is our response to that? I mean, my only response is never to leave Newton. It feels like we live in a bubble of sanity. And I'd be very hesitant to go to certain parts of the country and drive, lest, somebody has road rage and shoots you. I mean, I would literally be hesitant to go to large parts of our country that have gun culture. I'm wondering what your thoughts are for living in our country now with this unwellness. Yes, John, please.
I don't know the answer to that question to start, but I don't think God's the answer, because a lot of the people who are opposing, for example, gun control, are faith-based communities with tremendous political power. So I don't think the answer is in God. I think, and I don't know what the answer is, but I think for each of us, we have only control over ourselves and have a significant life, certainly not an immortal life. I don't believe that's real, is to do what you think is going to be helpful to other people, your family, and do the best you can. I know of, and we are fortunate, all of us in this thing, because we live in Newton and we have a supportive community, and most of us have adequate means, that we have a luxury that many people don't have. But within that, I think we also have a responsibility to do what we can do. And whatever lives on, we don't have any control over anyway. But I don't think that a relationship to God is the answer, pro or con. So I agree with a lot of what Paul said.
Yeah, thank you, John. Actually, it's a really interesting take, John. I mean, I feel like Jewish skepticism about God has grown deeper in my, in my 26 years at the synagogue. I think God gets an even cooler reception today than happened years earlier. And your comments, John, suggest to me a possible read for that, which is so much of God talk in the public square is connected to other values that many of us find challenging. Like there's the Christmas card from the congressman in Tennessee. This was after the school in Nashville was shot up, and the congressman for that district sent out a picture, a Christmas card with him and his wife and his perfect kids, and everyone had a gun Christmas card. And so I think that probably poisons the very concept of God for a lot of people. And I hadn't put two and two together. So anyway, I want to leave you with the prayer that I do think that one thing that we can do is to build a significant life by having a good impact on the people in our life, family, friends, community. And I think Judaism gives us a roadmap to do that. And that feels like it's all that any of us can do, and it's a lot if we can actually do it. So, my prayer is that we all find our way into the Jewish story, and by investing our life with Torah and mitzvah and Jewish community, that we'll invest our lives with great significance. So thank you so much, guys, and we will see you next week.
Have a good week.
You too.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.